Hi everybody, good afternoon and welcome to this event chaired by the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. It's such a big pleasure to see all of you here today. On a personal note, my name is Carsten Bæk. I'm working at the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. And I remember the last time CIFS did an event here at Nationalmuseet. That was before Corona. So last time, it's I don't know, 3 years ago, something like that. And now it's such a joy to see all of you back in the seats, hoping, or at least I'm hoping, that you're eager to discuss a very, very important topic that we have in front of us here today, the question of sustainability, the question of global footprint. A special and warm welcome to Mr. Mathis Wackernagel from the Global Footprint Network. I guess you will introduce yourself just in a short while. The program today is actually fairly simple. We have an hour together here in this room, and we'll have a 30-minute lecture or keynote from Mathis on footprint and sustainability, and we will follow that with a Q&A session for 30 minutes. So please, while you listen, think about, okay, what would you like to know more about? What would be your interest? Before we get started, and I know it's so good to see lots of old friends of CIFS here today, but I also see some new faces. So to the new friends in the room, Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies, just so you know, think tank working here, actually sitting down in Blocktop, somewhere 200 meters in that direction, working with trends, working with scenarios on a global scale. One of the trends, one of the key themes that pops up in everything we do at CIFS at the moment is the green transition. It is what we do with the climate. Let me just tell you one small story before we get started. I was yesterday talking to a big, major foundation here in Denmark, and we talked about the future of retail. We talked about what will happen to cities, not only in Denmark actually, but cities across the globe in a world where e-commerce and digital supply chains and all of that will gradually change the landscape of cities. And then in the middle of this discussion, we actually all agreed that, okay, but there's one thing we want to avoid. There's one thing we cannot do, and that is we cannot go back to before Corona and keep doing what we did 3 or 4 years ago. We need to change. We need to find new methods. We need to find a new setup for society, for consumption, for production, for energy systems, etc., etc., etc. So it's actually stated as a trend, and it's been stated as a trend at CIFS for a very long time, I would say. But how to go about it and what we see as the next steps, that is where it gets critical and it gets interesting. And with these words, Mathis, I would like to invite you on stage for your keynote.
Tak, Kirsten, for invitation. Det er en stor fornøjelse at være her i Danmark og snakke sammen med alle de her om vores fremtid. Jeg har en varm spot i min hjerte for Danmark. Thanks to René, who is here. We met in 1985 in Thy. I had 3 love affairs with Denmark in the 1980s. The first one is just Denmark as a whole. Can you hear me? It's probably better like this. The first love affair was with Denmark as a whole. I grew up in Switzerland. Very similar to Denmark, a small country, very democratically organized on the edge of other big powers, but with very different decisions, particularly back then. We continued to live in a Cold War in Switzerland. We didn't know that World War II had stopped. And Denmark at that time was thinking so differently, you know. giving up to say D, just saying do from one year to the next. And just kind of the idea of the welfare state and how you work with each other. So I was fascinated by that. And I learned about it for the first time in our first excursion as a family coming to Denmark to see Legoland and Tivoli and spend time in Thy. That's the first time in Thy, and swim in the cold ocean. We never went to Italy because, I don't know why, we thought we'd go to the mountains. And I didn't know that oceans could be warm, so we swam in Kattegat and Skagerrak, and it was awesome. And then as a boy, I was able to see the Viking explorations, what could be better. That was amazing. And then, of course, also, I met a wonderful woman in Denmark at the time, very clever and creative. That was the second love affair. And the third one was the windmill industry, which links me to René back then. In the mid-'80s, it was like wild. They were thinking about how can we scale up the windmills from 50 kilowatt to 75 kilowatt. And would the lattice towers remain the main choice because they're much cheaper than these tubular towers, which are unnecessarily fancy. So that was kind of the big battle. But then in the mid-'80s, there was a slump in the windmill industry. I don't know if you remember that, because now it probably wouldn't show up on the statistics of like this little blip downwards back in the 80s. And I had a Swiss mechanical engineering degree, and that was pre-Erasmus, which meant I would have had to redo the entire mechanical engineering degree here again to help build windmills. And so somehow my future changed, so it's not just kind of the world's future, but my future then changed, and I moved on to other places, and now I'm back in Denmark, and it's awesome. So thank you for coming here. My lecture can be very short, and if you intervene or have questions or we look with long faces, then it gets longer probably in some ways. Anyhow, so it's all a conversation. It starts with the insight I wish I had earlier. I started as an engineer, as I said, and then I went to Canada thinking about how do you apply societal change to that as well. And nobody's allowed to study social engineering because that sounds horrible, but that's really what it is, trying to find out how can you produce transformation, how do you get from insight to action. And what I learned in the 30 years since, and only more recently, is the following. Information is useless unless it's empowering. Because yes, information needs to be accurate, because eventually you'll be found out. It helps. It doesn't have to be, but it does help, because otherwise you kind of run into walls. And also it has to be relevant, because if it's not relevant, it's irrelevant, which doesn't help. But if it's just relevant and not empowering, it becomes counterproductive. Why? Because people have beautiful organ in their skull, it's called the brain, and they use it to find out about excuses if they just see it as relevant but not empowering. And if you have heard of climate change, I think some of here have, then you may also remember there was this movie called Inconvenient Truth, and I think that still describes excessively to what extent we relate to that idea of climate change. Because inconvenient truth truly means that the more you know, the worse you're off. The more you know, the more you have to carry this burden of suffering for humanity and don't get back much. And that's, I would say, how we characterize the context. Is that really an accurate description of the game we're in, whether we like it or not? We're standing on a chessboard, but what is the chessboard? I would say it's the following one. It's that, and I don't know if I dare to say that here because you put an S behind futures, but we would say the future has never been more predictable. And that doesn't mean that the future is predictable, but it never has been more predictable. For example, we know that people will want to eat, they will want to be housed, they will want to be safe, they want to have a good time, they want to move about, We know that. And you can say we knew that in the past too, which also confirms that we do know a lot about the future all the time. We don't know if there will be gravity tomorrow, but the likelihood that there will be gravity tomorrow is pretty high. But in a strict scientific sense, we don't know. It's not observable tomorrow. But we can extrapolate. We also know the following. In any imaginable scenario, there will be more climate change and fewer resources. There may be different combinations of the two. We can choose to go out of fossil fuels faster and have less climate change, but then we don't have the fossil fuels, or we wait a little bit and then we'll have less biological resources, because climate change is not just about buying more AC equipment for cities. It is that with climate change and more variable weather, we're moving out of the Holocene, and the productivity of the planet is going to be more variable, and agriculture will be less predictable, and the biological resource situation becomes less dependable overall. So that's what we know about the future, and the question is, what's the business case of not preparing yourself for that future? What's the benefit of waiting for China to take the big step forward? The business case is the opposite. If China doesn't move, the risk for you is even higher, and you have an incentive to act even faster. That makes sense? It's exactly the opposite of what we get told often, I think. To me, the situation looks a bit like standing on a train track. Maybe you have done that before, and the train is coming at great speed, but we argue whether we need 35 korn or more, I'm just translating, or 5 euros, or whatever it may be, more to get off the track. This is how you get off the track. You take one foot, like this. Do you need 35 crowns more to get off the track when the train is coming? In some ways. Because the incentives are far more aligned with economic reality than we think. That's something we can debate. Now already think of your counterexample. I'm sure you have a few. If that's true, is it true? Let's find out. First, how can we be so certain about aspects of the future? We can't be certain, but there's strong indication that we are entering into a world with different rules, not because they're imposed by somebody else, but because how the dynamics plays out in a different chessboard. The different chessboard is now defined by a humanity that's becoming a geological force, meaning that we have become very large compared to the biosphere. How large? To understand how large we are, we need to understand what's really the relationship between us as one animal species with that body called Earth. And what the game really is that we, humans, with other animals, are in competition for everything we do for what Earth can renew. Largely biomass regeneration. The fish that I eat is not available to the seal, and vice versa, for example. And so are we in competition for the carrot. In some ways, we can't eat the carrot twice. So we are in a competitive game around Earth renewable capacity. And if you look at the world from that perspective and say we are in the end competing for that ultimate budget of regeneration, it becomes much easier to look at that world. Because in the end, the question is, how are we using that budget? Are we overusing it? Is there a benefit in overusing it? When we translate that in terms of what's the regeneration of the planet, we think like farmers, because I spent a lot of time in my youth as on farm, and so it's kind of, it's a metaphor, but it's not really a metaphor. The world is a big farm. How much capacity is there on the planet? If you look at all the productive area on the planet, which is not all the deserts and ice caps, but the productive area, is about 1.5 hectares of ecologically productive space. That's what we've got. For us, and how many species? Nobody knows, but wild species, probably like some people say 100 million species, not all of them are animals, but a big part of it are kind of animal-like creatures. And then the question obviously is the other one, how much do we use for your orange juice, for your coffee, for your shoes, even if they're out of plastic, that also takes resources that in the end compete for renewal. If you emit CO2, the question is how much capacity is necessary to absorb that if you don't want to build up ecological debt. And if you do that, then there's less space for the carrots that we try to eat, you know? So it's all in competition. Even mining in the end, it's not so much how much is underground. There's a lot of stuff underground. We just would need to dig deeper. That takes more energy. It also destroys ecosystems. So also using metals and minerals is in competition for regeneration. And you can see fossil fuels, aren't they limited by how much is underground? Of course they're limited by how much is underground. But there's too much already underground. If we burned everything we know already, I've seen certain assessments, we'd go to about 2,000 ppms, CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere. And at that time, they recommend strongly to air the rooms, because otherwise you get sleepy. So we would be very sleepy at that time. Not very practical. So there's too much underground, so the limiting factor really is how much can the biosphere cope with, you know? That's the limiting factor. Anyhow, so how much do we use? As a conservative estimate, we use about 15,000 data points per country and year. And if I say we, it's a bit wrong, because now the accounts are in a separate organization to make them kind of come down from heaven like GDP. You know, they're not, GDP is not branded. It just says GDP, and everybody says, oh yeah, GDP. Yeah, so it's a no brand number. So we hope to become also a no brand number from that perspective, to understand how much nature do we have, how much do we use. And we use about 2.7 global hectares, and some of you may think that must be a lie. How can you use more than what there is? There's only so much. And for me, as a Swiss, I think a little bit like that too, but I hear that in some places, people spend more money than they earn. I don't know if you have heard of that concept. And it is possible for some time, but then your assets go down. And that's the same ecologically. We can use more than what there is. About 75% more, and so that translates, an easy way of saying it is like using 1.75-fold what Earth can renew. And would it be the best for humanity to use the entire planet? Ecologists say to maintain biodiversity, we should leave some space for other species. A number that's now kind of circulating, if you want to maintain about 85% of biodiversity, don't use more than half of the planet. So half the planet compared to 1.75, you may be able to calculate in your head what's the ratio between. It's over 3. Over 3-fold global average metabolic mismatch currently as a global average, you could say. You can also translate that into time, because that's easier for people, and that's perhaps one of my largest pride, and I can say that because I didn't invent it. We have Earth Overshoot Day. Somebody else came up with the idea for us, a friend of ours, and then we started to implement it. And the idea is to say between January 1st and July 28th, humanity has used as much, or people have used as much, as the planet can renew in the entire year. And the only 3-syllable word I used is January. January. And young people can understand January. Even. It's not so complicated of a sentence. They can also understand that 28th of July is far away from Christmas, and Christmas is not even the end of the year. There are actually 156 days missing between 28th of July and the end of the year. So it explains something that people haven't heard. Overshoot is a word that doesn't translate in many languages, and even in the English language is not that known, even though it's the underlying disease. We call it the second largest risk. We don't just call it, we believe it's the second largest risk that humanity is facing in the 21st century. And we don't have a name for it. Of course, you can also calculate it at all different levels. You can bring it down to the toothbrush. You can bring it down to countries. And I will give you the right link. You can play with it at home to see how is Denmark performing. I won't show you today, because if I show you, I'd take the appetite away, you know, so I'll leave it open for you. To go and click on Denmark and see the time trends. And what we found is, and that René might be interested because you have worked in international development for a long time, is that currently 75% of the world population live in countries with 2 conditions. So the red countries are the ones that use more than when their ecosystems renew. The darker red, the more they use compared to what they have, and it's a ratio, you know. So in Australia, they use tremendously a lot. They just are luckily being extremely ecologically rich, so they have more than what they use. In India, they have about 4 times less per person than the world average, but still they use more than that. So the double condition is the following. 72% of the world population live in countries that both have an ecological deficit, which you cannot have forever, and already today have less than average income. Now, it will never be possible that everybody will have more than average income. And less than average income means you cannot buy the shirt off the other people's back that easily. You know, the flow goes in one direction, from those who have money towards the other. The money, like the resource flow goes to the ones who actually have the money in the end. So that's the 72% in that square. And you may say, I don't live in this square. And that's true for most of you, I'm sure, by the fact that you're here in Denmark. You do run an ecological deficit, but you have higher than world average income. So you could say, it doesn't concern me. This is such a broad trend. It's inescapable. It's going to shape the way we'll interact with each other, whether we are able to get the resources we want or not. So it's not just about the Maldives. Poor Maldives, far away. Let's move on. You know. We can also look into the future, and I wanted to show you a little tool that also on our website is very simple. Because in the end, the key driver is not so much how much we use more than what Earth can renew. Like with your deficit spending for 1 year, you may be able to afford it. It's the persistence of that deficit spending that leads to an ecological debt. So it's the area under the curve. If you look at the one planet that we've had since I was born, I don't know before, but they tell me there was one planet too. But anyhow, I was born in '62, and I realized there's one planet, and then the red line shows how much we use. It's the difference between the red line and the green line, the accumulated area. Did you have calculus? Who had calculus? It's actually useful calculus. Some people think it's boring, but it's actually interesting to look at the area under the curve. And so far, we have spent or accumulated about 20 years of production of debt. So it would take the production, not taking anything, of 20 years of the planet, if it was reversible, to balance out that debt. And then we can look at how does it go in the future. We just look at the scenario where we have about like typical fertility rate of today, average footprint that we've had for the last 40 years per capita, and then we calculate it out. And we continue to see higher productivity of the planet, that's what we assume. And what we see as a result by 2100 is an accumulated debt of about 101 planet years, 5 times more than today. Is that physically possible? I don't know. And now I want to show you that you can have some choices. Do people want to play? I think we have it here. Is that true? Here it is on the website. So what would you like? What should we do? You can choose how quickly we can implement a change, and then we can take it down. See? Population goes down, 1.4. Oops. Okay, so this scenario now, we just brought reproduction rate down to the level that we find now in Portugal, Italy, South Korea, Japan, for example, within the next 25 years. For example, it still believes that planet's biocapacity continues to increase at the rate we've seen in the past because we have been doping with agriculture, intensifying agriculture, so we have been able to increase the regeneration. Will it be possible to maintain it in the world of overshoot? Maybe that rate is unlikely. Let's see what happens if we keep it consistent, if we just keep it at the current level, for example. That would mean we go to 0. Then it would look like this. You know, for example, and we would then get to 45 planet years of debt. Does that not make sense? You look a little puzzled. No, too many? Yeah, please.
So just a question. So you do incorporate the assumption that if we overspend, the biocapacity will decrease over time.
So here, this is just a mathematical extrapolation of your assumptions. You can choose all the assumptions yourself and you put them into this calculator. So you choose how many people, or what's the reproduction rate, like age of mothers, so that because that makes an impact on demographics. We didn't put mortality in there. We assumed constant lifespan, so people don't like to choose lower lives, perhaps. And then you can also choose the planet's biocapacity. How will it increase? So that was the last slider. Now it's at 0. It means we keep biocapacity at the same level as today. So we hope that all this debt doesn't lead to a reduction of biocapacity. But you choose.
But wouldn't it lead to a reduction? Like as we degrade?
We should ask people from future studies. We just look at the past. But it's a good question, and I wondered about that question too. And then I went to agricultural departments because I wanted to answer this question. I had the same question, and what I realized is there were the plant breeders on one side who said we can breed anything, no matter what, no problem. And then on the other side of the aisle, they were good friends, but they never talked with each other about their studies. I think they said, "Oh, soil. We're losing soil at the rate you wouldn't believe. Without soil, we're dead. That is the most important dirt, you know." So anyhow, so I would think with more climate change and more damaged, you know, situations, you'll have less biocapacity. Yeah. So but I don't know. So that's you play it out. What kind of increase would you need to see in order to balance it out? Is that possible or not? So yeah. But all the assumptions are exogenous now. It's about you choosing. Yeah. Anyhow, good. Now we go back. You can play more at home. If I can go back, is that true? Yeah, back. This one. Okay. Now the question is, there may be some entrepreneurs among you. What does that mean for the entrepreneur in you or among you? So we would say, the big question we would ask is the following. It's a very simple question. If you think the future is one of climate change and resource constraints, what will be valuable? What will be valuable in a future of climate change and resource constraints? And we think it's those companies that if you expand them, global overshoot goes down. Why? Or let me first explain, is that even possible? But the why is these companies will not run into ecological constraints, into resource constraints, and they also will be needed more because they offer a service that helps. Does that make sense? So to give you an example, the car company is an anti-example. You build more cars, global overshoot goes up. The down example is famous Danish companies that René and I wanted to get more prolific in the world. If you build them, it takes resources, but if they displace coal power, global overshoot goes down. Now, is asking the question, what will be more valuable in the future, a capitalist plot? And I would say it's as capitalist of a plot as brushing your teeth. Because brushing your teeth is an investment in maintaining your tooth capital. And is going to sustainability a moralist plot? I would say it's like brushing your tooth. Is it a moral obligation to brush your teeth? You know what I mean? It's just practical, it's helpful, it's healthy, I think. But ultimately it's about you. Is Denmark destroying Denmark? Is Copenhagen destroying Copenhagen? Is a much more realistic question. Not how much is Copenhagen willing to give up to be a nice city for the world? Do we need carbon and climate plans, or do we need prosperity plans? On some level. Because a true prosperity plan will be far more radical. Because the solution to overshoot in the end is one planet prosperity. One planet prosperity means we want to live well, and there's one planet. And it's also an easy choice because the only alternative I could think of is not two-planet prosperity, it's one-planet misery. That's the other option. And then you can think which one is a more interesting option, and then we'll work on that one. So to apply that even more is we realized it's a pretty easy calculation looking at the entire footprint of the world and compare that with the entire GDP of the world, that per dollar or euro, or how many, 7 crowns or so many crowns, of GDP generation, it takes about 2.5 square meters of productive space to make that happen. Every year on that 2.5 square meters, you can generate $1 value add on average. And so we worked with this $1 billion company. It's privately held, you cannot buy a share. That was kind of inspired by this idea of what can we do? They do recycling, large-scale recycling, but also closed-loop logistics. That for every unit of resources that they use, they save about 6 to 7. And for every dollar value add, they reduce global overshoot by 28 square meters at least. Reduce in the right direction, tenfold more than world average. When we calculated that, they got very excited and say, now we also want to know how much have we shifted Earth overshoot day? And for us, being numerate, immediately said, you don't want to know that. It's going to be so little, you'll be so disappointed. There's no good use for that number. They said, no, we want to know. We said, only if you don't tell anybody else. So we calculated and came to the conclusion it was 4 minutes, 20 seconds. So if they didn't exist as a company, Earth Overshoot Day would have happened 4 minutes, 20 seconds earlier, which is still the same date, but still earlier. Now there are 43,000 listed companies in the world, so it's not like everything is on their shoulders. And they thought, wow, that's pretty cool, 4 minutes 20. And they immediately told their friends, and it didn't backfire, which we're very happy about. So we misjudged humanity. They thought it was a good idea. And so now the next step is, wow, how about having a 1-hour club? How about bringing companies together? We already have 4 minutes 20. Are there other ones we can add, and then it's a 1-hour club? It's a contribution towards the missing 156 days. There's still a bit more hours, I understand, but still it shows possibilities of how can you move in this direction. And even more so, can we go and talk with the finance institutions, which we do, particularly those who have impact funds, and say, how many seconds of Earth overshoot do you own? That's true for any portfolio. You may be owning so many seconds in the wrong direction, or so many seconds in the good direction. If you're a true impact fund, is your impact fund truly owning a certain slice of the right direction? So could there be a 1-hour club in Denmark? We just talked with some friends of yours, and I think there are some companies in Denmark that would qualify and say, wow, probably if they didn't exist, we would have Earth Overshoot Day earlier. I mean, an obvious one is Vestas, would be interesting to calculate. We worked with a large company called Schneider Electric in France. Now around the world, they work on decarbonization and digitization. And for them, we calculated more the market potential. We calculated how many days would be Move Earth Overshoot Day if their existing technology, and we all acknowledge there may be even better one around, but if their technology on the shelf today, at cost currently, would be deployed where it could be deployed. And we realized it would be at 21 days. So their market potential is enormous, and they're fearless. They are not afraid of climate. They don't have to have euphemisms when they talk about the future. Their staff is quite on fire because they know they're moving into a positive future, and they can look into their children's eyes and everything. Everything looks good. It's all an upside overall. So could there be a 1-hour club? 8 Klubben. Now you may think that's an exception. That's just this crazy German company doing recycling, these Germans. But actually, if you look at it, we have this power of possibility. There's also a link. If you go to footprintnetwork.org/tools, I will show that again at the end. We have about 100 possible ways of how to move Earth Overshoot Day. And they are organized. I could show that with my hand here. You have seen a hand before. Mostly it has 5 fingers. And with the thumb represents the productivity of the planet. What are the opportunities there? There's a lot of opportunities, like how to improve, like regenerative agriculture, for example, restoration for carbon sequestration, many possibilities to have economic activities and strengthen the biocapacity. So that's from the strengthening side. And the demand side of the 4 fingers, the cities is one. How do we organize them? Are they good for bicycles or not? Are the houses well insulated? Do you have long transportation ways, etc.? You get more educated by the cities how to live than by your parents, essentially. Ale, my colleague, lives close to Siena. Siena compared to a place like Atlanta. Which one gets more tourists per person, People seem to like Siena. And at the same time, it's organized in a way that the same quality of life is able, with a far fewer, like perhaps factor 3 or 4, if we haven't calculated in specificity, 3 and 4 factor difference between these 2 cities. And then how do you power these cities? The middle finger, so that's that one. Either windmills, Danish windmills of course, or coal power. The one in between, when you just put biomass into your coal power plants, it still has footprint, in some ways. In Switzerland, we burn our waste because it's a state doctrine to say it's carbon-free. I'm not sure exactly how they come to the conclusion because the carbon intensity of garbage in Switzerland, it's high-quality garbage, but still it's much lower than coal. But the state doctrine says it's carbon-free because, inconvenient truth, we already built these power plants and build more heat distribution networks. So anyhow, so that's to say it's not carbon-free is not convenient. Therefore, their brains are very active in finding ruses. Anyhow. And then food, over 50% of the biocapacity is food. 55 we estimate, and that's just food. Like how many Netherlands does it take to feed the Dutch? The 3rd largest agricultural exporter. Now we're just talking about how many Netherlands does it take to feed the Dutch? What do you think? Yeah? Maybe a third. According to our resource flow analysis, which is an underestimate, we use UN data sets, 2. It takes 2 Netherlands to feed the Dutch. It takes 7 Netherlands for the entire resource metabolism, not leaving anything for other species. So that's the difference between a financial view. They have high value exports, so yes, indeed, exports are very valuable, but they also come from a lot of imports, a lot of energy use. So last one is the population dimension. Obviously, if you have double as many people, there's only half as much planet. So if you look prospectively, if you truly love people and say what is best for humanity, would it be better to be more people? Would it be better to be fewer people? Some people say we want to maximize population, but why do they all have to live at the same time? So it's nice you can meet them. You can't meet them if they live too distant in the future. I understand there's a downside to that. But actually, if you want to maximize population size, better to spread them over time. You get much larger population possibilities. With that, I would like to come to a conclusion and say, some people say the future is in your hand. Have you heard that expression? That's the hand. It's in your hand. You can go home, you can show your children, you can show your parents, you can show everybody. Not stop, but say, this is the possibility. The possibilities are in your hand. And with that, I'd like to close. If you want to play with more tools, they're here for you. And then you'll tell us. There's actually a box on one of them. You can give us feedback immediately and say, this sucks. And then we take that very seriously, and we'll get back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mathis. We now have an open mic session. So we have a mic moving around over here with Mikkel. Any kind of questions, comments, Mathis, can I invite you into the lights?
Oh, I'm not in the light. I'm so sorry. I wanted to see you. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, but now you can see everybody. So, open mic.
That's how I look like, just in case.
Oh, there you are. Any kind of questions?
Not just
comments?
any kind. I've once heard there are no indiscreet questions, only indiscreet answers.
Absolutely.
So it's all on my shoulders.
Yeah.
Whether it's indiscreet or not. Yeah.
And maybe I could start, just raise your hand and then we'll move the mic over there. But Mathis, I noticed on your world map that Ethiopia and Nigeria and Africa were kind of red. And seeing those countries as emerging as some sort of at least regional superpowers. Any comments to that? Any kind of shortcuts or insights there?
International, I mean, there's so many aspects to it. Just one aspect that is much closer to here, because a lot of people think about international development. For example, there's about $150 billion. I don't know exactly the latest numbers, but in the last few years has been quite a constant or flat. $150 billion a year is used in international development efforts. And sadly, they're not that strongly informed by the resource reality. We have heard more about, oh, we need to climate-proof development, which sounds to be like a conditionality, make something difficult even more difficult. Oh, isn't poverty eradication already difficult enough? Why would you even worry about adding something else that is not even their problem initially? You know, so that's, I would say it's the other way around. We did a paper last year in Nature Sustainability, exactly on that, which I showed the results, the 72%. That's called the importance of resource security for poverty eradication. Reducing overshoot, getting overshoot through design is probably the most significant social deed we can do if we want to make sure people can live in decent lives. So resource security is core. Yeah.
Thank you. We have the first question over here and the second here.
Thanks, Mathis, for this positive story in what are very troublesome times. And so you present some opportunities and how things could be solved. And I wanted to come to the design, and then how the design fits with what was the initial intention here to showcase the consumption footprint. And overshoot will be linked to overconsumption. And just to try to look at, okay, what you present are mostly systems changes, yes. Efficiency gains, yes. But if you compare to the planetary boundary concept, the donut concept, it's all about, okay, what is the fair share in this whole context? And so in that design, is there not a need to define some kind of how much is enough question? And what is then a certain level of material wealth? Because if you just, and I try to wrap up the question, if you look at the current situation of the world population with what is available and what is available in the OECD countries, and there is only that one planet, honestly, there's not 1.5 or there's only one. Within those boundaries, how would we design a context in which we redistribute a fair share for all? How does that fit the narrative of the positive story that you brought, by the way?
Yeah, very good. So first on the design, Denmark is a country of design, great design. And and overshoot will end. It will end. The question is only whether by design or disaster. So why not use design? Design means the conscious choice of designing our personal lives, like societal life, etc. So the question about the fairness part, we deliberately separate description from normative choices. So we provide first just a description of how the world looks like. You can look at who gets how much. Like with GDP, there are no demonstrations in front of the World Bank saying it's unfair that Ethiopia has such a low GDP. You shouldn't publish that. You know, that's just a description of what is. And then by looking at what is, we can start to think, is that really the best way forward in some ways? In the old days, we mixed, in the very, very, very old days, 25 years ago, we mixed the two concepts. We talked about this, how much is available in the planet. We called, because it rhymes so beautifully, fair share. And people say like, who are you to say what's fair? You know, and it's true. Who are we to say it's fair? We just describe what is, how much is where, and then we can think about what's useful. In China, they teach about resources in high schools. I've heard that now confirmed by various people. And they say 3 things you need to know about resources. First thing, resources are important. Second thing, we have to look after our resources, manage them well. And third things, let's first use the resources from other places. And the fact that you laugh shows that we have a different relationship with resources than with money. With money, you would say, money is important, manage it well. If somebody else has budget, let them pay. Yeah? Fewer people laugh because that seems, normal. You know? So the same thing is true with resources. If every country thought these things about let's use other people's resources first, we all would be very careful with our resources. We would take them seriously. I think that's a piece that's missing, that we're still stuck a little bit in the colonial mindset, which at the essence, what is a colonial mindset is the idea you can always get more from somewhere else. And that's a mathematically not yet proven hypothesis. Probably will never be proven because it's mathematically inconsistent.
Thank you. And before we get to the question there, can I just add that at CIFS we just published, we have a small model on the consumption side of sustainability and climate change. And the key results is actually quite interesting. We have, in Denmark, we have 40% of the population basically pretending to have the values, attitudes, listening to you, sir, but not really changing everything in everyday life. Then we have 14%, and once again, our model is a little bit more simple than yours, but 14% that are more or less on the money, value-wise and consumption-wise. Then we still have 40% in Denmark going, why bother? This is not important. People talk about it. We have an election coming up. Something else is important right now. So there's a certain amount of stubbornness right now. And then we have 6% of the population, which is, in my opinion, underappreciated because they actually have a consumption bundle that is sustainable within the limits in our small model. But their attitude and mindset is not green at all. They don't care. But they have the right mentality when it comes to consumption. And I think maybe we in Denmark we could build on that.
Yes.
There's some nice sound habits and ways of looking at energy consumption at large. But the numbers altogether don't really add up. Sorry about that. Let's get over here.
Thank you for your presentation. Very, very interesting. I'm working at a project regarding land use in Denmark and the future of land use in Denmark.
With Concito.
Exactly, yeah. I think the way that you presented the 1 hour club concept, where you bring back the date for the overshoot, is a very powerful messaging. And I wondered, is it possible for you to do you have on the website or in any other way tools that makes it possible for example for a project as ours to put on hours or minutes or weeks or dates on different kinds of scenarios regarding the land use as it pertains to the overshoot date?
I think it's a very interesting question. Like what's available to make these calculations. In some ways, we are more similar to GDP. We say, GDP says money is important, we say regeneration is important. GDP says we want to find out how much value is being created in terms of dollars in the market. And we say we want to find out how much regeneration is necessary to maintain our resource throughput currently. So we have a clear research question and our accounts around those. And so we show principles of how accounting works. We still need good accountants for every company, etc., to do the accounts. So we show the principles We have shown examples, but in the end, it's not just kind of, even though it's just one number, GDP, there's a lot of numbers behind it because it accounts for everything. We also account for everything. Everything is a lot, you know, so it takes that difficulty. But you have the principles, and then you can make first approximations like with money, or so the best would be have a chat with us, or, you know. But it's about the principle, and we're providing a principle. It's not a method. It's an underlying way of thinking. Mm-hmm. But it's applicable, yeah.
Thank you. We have the next question here.
The ice cream is coming over.
All right, it's so good. Okay, thank you very much, Mathis. My name is Michael. I'm about the same age as you, and I've been fighting for the nature all my life, and I'll continue. So I'm very happy to see that you are doing such an effort. I wonder whether there are any politicians in here who are actually picking up on some of these enormously important issues and placing them in the debate for our election here, which they just had in Sweden, by the way. And back to your model here, one of the things that we see is that your span of red on the globe, where consumption are more than what can be produced, we find that that consumption are generated by most of the Western countries, where you actually here in Denmark use about 16 times the average personally resource spent in Africa, and even more in Mexico. Yeah. I think that's a serious issue. I was wondering whether you are accounting for that in your model for consumption.
Yeah. So this map shows the ratio between how much people use in a country compared to what the country's ecosystems can renew. So this is the consumption number. So it's like GDP accounting is a whole account, and then you can look at different things, what's for production. This is from the consumption side, and we account for 15,000 data points per country and year. So what the potatoes that are being produced in Denmark but exported to Germany to eat, they are done, the exported parts are taken away because that's not what you consume here. It's a consumption perspective. Why we look at the ratio, it's one way. You can also look at relative consumption. We think it's just interesting because it shows the economic dynamics. You have a difference. It's like being on a farm that happens to be small. It's not fair that you have a small farm, but the small farm is what you have. Given that, what challenges and opportunities does that present? So this is just one way, but you could also look at relative consumption, and that also shows you different important things.
But if you take it a bit away from the model and look at how does good look like? How does good look like? What is good to us, to humanity, to the planet, to nature? And this is an awful picture, in my view. Yeah. And also, in my view, I'm telling you that may not show the accurate picture of where consumption are actually generated, where the requirement for resource is generated, where is spent, where weapons are used to be in the. And I think you mentioned yourself the power of economics. Most of this is driven by greed. That's a political statement, I know, but I'm just wondering, could you, as a preacher for this, and I think it's really good, identify areas where we could make our neighbors, ourselves, our family, our politicians understand what the hand is and what is really important and what can be done by it tomorrow.
Yeah, very good. One of my great-grandfathers was a linguist and a friend of the brother Grimm's. But my ancestor wasn't as successful, so there are no Wackernagel fairy tales. There are Grimm fairy tales and Andersen fairy tales. And I mention that because when you look at greed in fairy tales, and I think greed is something, we have everything in us. We have love in us, we have hate in us, we have greed in us, we have all generosity in us, etc. And so I'm not saying they can be channeled. But when you look at the fairy tales of the Grimms, for example, and you look at greed, it manifests in hoarding, not in spending. So if we applied our greed on hoarding our biocapacity, we would be much better off. And that's why, we gave up in 1995, in general, to say the term, let's reduce our footprint. Because I did say that before, and I was in a lecture in Chile that was younger people, like a very young woman at the end of the room said at the end, why should I reduce my footprint so that you can eat more chocolate? Which was very astute and honest. Many thought that before, never dared to tell me. And so what we say now, it's very boring, but it's psychologically transformational, I think, and I explain why. Is we say what we want is more resource security rather than less footprint. And why is it psychologically so transformational? Because saying, I want you to reduce is a resentment-producing engine. Because if I give myself up for humanity and shower cold and my neighbor doesn't care, I start to hate my neighbor, feel resentful and cynical myself, and give up on my cold showers, for example. You know, so it's kind of, oh my God, I give myself up and I don't get any love back, it's terrible. When I think about it from a resource security perspective, I start to realize I invest in my own ability to be secure. And I can start to feel empathy for my neighbor who doesn't know that yet and is extremely exposed to the risk that we'll face in the future. So by telling the story in a way, it's more important than say, how much do we save? Are we generating empathy or are we generating cynicism and resentment? So how do we bring people into the tent to generate that? For me, the measurable outcomes we need to generate to be successful, and that's what we also discussed in Global Footprint Network together, is motivation. And motivation we see as three specific things that we need to be able to build. One is a true desire for that outcome, because now it's not a true desire, we think it's a burden. It's a burden we need to take care of, but nevertheless a burden. It has to be transformed into a desire, we want that. We also need to produce a sense of agency. There's a lot of young people who suffer from climate trauma. I think more than the climate that causes it is the way we talk about climate, that we give people the impression there's nothing that can be done and it's futile because everything you give up, somebody else will use up. You know? So rather than saying, no, there's a storm out there, let's make our boat stronger. That's also good for the others, by the way. So it's got this sense of agency that makes sense, is important. And the third thing is a dose of honesty. I wish in academic institutions would be told more honestly as well, is to say, we don't know. But not seeing the don't know as a limitation or as a barrier, but it's an invitation to curiosity. Wow, this is the most interesting thing, and we learn a new chapter every day. So I think that's what we need to create. Desire, a sense of agency, and a sense of curiosity. And if we can heighten that, we'll bring people into the tent, and the transformation becomes a self-fulfilling avalanche, rather than, you know, some command and control. Most policies are built on the assumption that we hate people, because the world would be better without you and you and you, but you already exist, so let me cut your emissions in half. Type. I mean, I'm exaggerating for effect, but people don't feel the love, you know. So, and I think if we have to, or if we don't produce policies that stem from the sense of we love people, we make better stages at home, because probably they do more damage, because they just generate conflict within society, rather than invite to be creative together and say, what can we do together? It's a bit of a convoluted answer, but it's yeah. So I think it's how do we see what's happening in a way that is inviting to others?
And that is indeed, Mathis, a beautiful way of ending this session. Let's give Mathis a big round of applause. We're almost done.
This is not the end.
No, it's not.
This is the beginning of the conversation. And then also, I don't know if there's anybody here in the finance industry, we had an idea just in case we wanted to do a little breakfast tomorrow, but there wasn't that much interest. And the breakfast would have been named the following. If ESG, who knows what ESG is? Yay! If ESG is for breakfast, what's for lunch?
Yeah. I can tell all of you right now that the discussion will not stop here, because we would like to invite all of you for a drink outside of this room, so we can continue discussing this discussion, which in my opinion, you ended in such a beautiful way with the optimism and the curiosity and the changing of mindsets. Unfortunately, the next session CIFS will be doing will be the exact opposite, because our next seminar, and we would like to invite all of you to participate, it will be an online event only, will be one of the challenges that we need to address when we talk about sustainability and the world at large. And that is our latest Farsight magazine, which in my mind, unfortunately, has the headline, "A World Pulled Apart." A world that is not collaborating, that is not having a positive spin on how to work on these issues we discussed today and many other issues in a constructive manner. But nevertheless, this seems to be on the agenda right now. So not only do we have to look into the future of sustainability, we also need to address the fact that we are not on the same stage and the same scene as the rest of the world. And that will be, Matthias, on November the 2nd, online at 2 o'clock. We hope to see you there. We thank you so much for being here today. And let's all meet outside for a drink. Thank you.